I didn't realize I'd been staring at the coffee stain on my notebook until her voice cut through the quiet hum of the repair shop. "You're not paying attention to the lesson, are you?" I looked up. She was standing there, arms crossed, leaning just enough over my desk that I caught the faint scent of her perfume, something subtle, warm, and impossible to place. My throat went dry, and I had to force myself to swallow before I managed a half grin. I was listening," I said, though my eyes betrayed me. I'd been watching the way her fingers brushed against the edge of the counter, the way a few stray strands of silver hair caught the fluorescent light. There was a confidence in her posture that made my own jitteriness feel like a spotlight on every wrong move I'd ever made. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, just enough to know she knew exactly how much I was fumbling. "Really?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, her eyes holding mine for a beat too long, and the air felt too tight, like I'd breathed in too much at once. I nodded, though I wasn't sure whether it was agreement or just a reflex to stop looking like an idiot. I didn't know why my hand itched to reach for the pen she'd set down on the corner of the desk, or why my chest had decided it was suddenly heavy with something I couldn't name. She straightened, moving back just a fraction, but that slight retreat only made me notice the warmth radiating from her presence more. There was a calmness in her voice now, soft but deliberate. "Sometimes it helps to see it, not just hear it," she said, pointing at the small engine we were supposed to be dissecting today. Her tone wasn't patronizing, it was patient, like she already knew I'd mess up, and somehow, that didn't make me feel worse. It made me want to prove I could be better. I watched her shift from leaning casually on the counter to moving around the workspace with that quiet authority, hands precise, shoulders relaxed but strong. Every motion was natural, confident, like she'd been here 1,000 times and yet was paying attention to everything at once, including me. A sudden clatter from the back made me jump, and she glanced over her shoulder, a faint crease of irritation between her brows, before returning to me. "Focus," she said, and somehow it wasn't a command. It was a tether, pulling my mind off the noise, onto her. I cleared my throat and picked up the wrench, feeling the weight of it suddenly heavier, more important than it had any right to be. I tried to mimic the way she handled the parts, the rhythm of her hands. Noticing that, she leaned closer again, this time with just enough proximity that my arm brushed hers. I jerked back slightly, not enough to be obvious, and she chuckled softly, a low sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest. She straightened, tilting her head toward the engine. "See? You can do this," she said, and I could swear her gaze lingered, just for a heartbeat longer than necessary. By the time she walked away to grab another set of tools, I was still staring at the spot where she'd stood, feeling the ghost of her presence in my chest. And somehow, I knew I wouldn't stop thinking about that moment. The way her eyes found mine, the tilt of her head, the brush of her arm. It was nothing and everything at the same time. I leaned back in my chair, pretending to scribble notes, but really, I was just trying to figure out why I couldn't stop thinking about her. Emotionally suggestive close. The narrator is completely captivated by a fleeting, layered moment, setting the stage for slow burn tension. The shop smelled faintly of motor oil and warm metal, the late afternoon light spilling across the workbench in golden streaks. I was supposed to be tightening the screws on the new carburetor, but I couldn't stop glancing at her. She moved with that effortless precision, the kind of rhythm that made everything she touched look intentional, even when she sighed, leaning over the engine in frustration. "Here, hold this," she said, her voice clipped but not unkind, handing me a small part. My fingers brushed hers for a second too long, and I felt heat spike up my forearm. She didn't flinch, didn't comment. Instead, she adjusted her glasses and muttered something under her breath, the corners of her lips twitching like she wanted to smile but couldn't. I noticed everything. The slight tremor in her hands as she tightened a bolt, the crease forming between her brows when she concentrated, the way her shoulders sagged just a fraction when she thought I wasn't looking. And yet she spoke with a kind of effortless confidence, explaining the next step as though she'd done it 1,000 times. I wondered, briefly, if anyone had ever seen her off guard like this before. "Are you sure you've done this before?" she asked suddenly, glancing at me over the engine. There was a vulnerability there, hidden behind the teasing tone, and it made my chest tighten. I nodded, fumbling slightly with the wrench. Her laugh, quiet and surprised at herself, filled the small space. It was soft, a little uneven, like she hadn't meant to let me hear it. I realized then that it was one of the first honest sounds I'd heard from her, and I wanted to hear it again, even if just for a moment. I passed her the screwdriver she'd dropped. Our fingers brushed again, lighter this time, and she didn't pull away, just looked at me for a heartbeat longer than necessary before turning her attention back to the engine. Her hair fell forward, brushing her cheek, and I couldn't stop noticing the faint lines near her eyes, the way her skin caught the afternoon light. "You're really focused," she said, almost to herself. She didn't meet my eyes, didn't have to. I knew she was aware of me. I wanted to say something that didn't feel like words at all, but instead I just handed her another tool. She accepted it without a word, her fingers brushing mine one more time. My palm tingled where we'd touched, and I was acutely aware of every small motion she made. The subtle tilt of her head, the quiet exhale, the way her eyes flicked to the window for a brief escape. For a moment, the world shrank to the space between us, the small hum of fluorescent lights, the distant rumble of cars outside, and the faint scent of her shampoo mingling with motor oil. She finally looked at me, her gaze steady, and smiled. Just the tiniest curve of her lips, like she was letting me in a little. And in that silence, I realized the pull between us was no longer just something I imagined. It was there, quiet but undeniable, charging the air between us. I wanted to reach out, to lean closer, but I stopped, because even this small connection, this tiny brush of hands, this fragile glance, felt dangerous in its intensity. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about her. Here, emotional asymmetry is key. She's guarded, yet subtly vulnerable. He's quietly observant, noticing micro-behaviors. The ending leaves a soft, charged tension without pushing the romance overtly. The rain tapped against the windows in uneven drumming, a muted soundtrack to the dim glow of the repair shop's fluorescent lights. Most of the day's chaos had faded, leaving just the hum of machines and the occasional drip from the roof. She was crouched beside the engine, hands smudged with grease, and I was on the other side, quietly wiping a tool. I don't know why this keeps happening," she muttered, more to herself than me, her voice low, tight with frustration. I leaned closer to point out something in the manual, and for a second, our knees brushed. My heart skipped. I froze, caught between wanting to pull back and wanting to let the proximity linger. Her hair fell over her shoulder, brushing her cheek, and I had to bite my lip to stop staring. "You think I should try the new gasket?" I asked, careful to keep my tone casual, even though every nerve felt alive. She glanced up at me, eyes sharp and assessing. "Maybe. Or maybe we're just rushing." Her fingers tightened around the piece she was holding, knuckles white. For a moment, I thought I saw something behind her eyes, a fatigue, a hesitation, a subtle vulnerability she wasn't ready to voice. I swallowed and looked down, pretending to focus on the diagram. I could feel her presence next to me like a live wire, and I wanted to reach over, brush a stray lock of hair behind her ear, but the thought stopped me cold. Not because I didn't want to, but because I could sense the unspoken rules hovering between us, lines we couldn't cross, even if our hearts were whispering differently. The silence stretched, punctuated by the occasional click of tools and the soft hiss of rain against the glass. I caught her glance, fleeting, before she looked away quickly, pretending to check the bolts. My pulse thumped in my ears. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "It's nothing," she said quickly when I raised my eyebrows, slipping the phone into her pocket. Her ex's name flashed briefly on the screen, and I felt a pang. Protective, jealous, something I couldn't name. I said nothing. Instead, I leaned slightly closer to help align the part, our shoulders brushing, our hands almost touching as we worked. She caught my gaze for the briefest moment, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement passing between us. "Careful," she murmured, almost a whisper. I caught the tension in her voice, the tiny tremor, and it made every hair on my arm stand on end. A clap of thunder rolled across the sky, loud enough to make us flinch. She jumped slightly, and I instinctively reached out, only to stop mid-motion, hovering too close. Her eyes widened, and I realized we were caught in that fragile, electric space where we both knew something could happen, but shouldn't. I pulled my hand back slowly, letting the moment slip, but the memory of it lingered. The shared secret, the unspoken desire, the near touch, they all settled like a weight in my chest. She straightened, brushing her hair back, pretending nothing had happened. I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat, and focused on the engine again. But I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd been, and I knew that if I leaned just a little more, I'd find out what it might feel like to cross the line, but I didn't. Not yet. The shop smelled faintly of rain and oil, a quiet after the storm outside. I was leaning against the workbench, watching her tighten the last few bolts on the engine. Normally, the sound of metal scraping and tools clinking would fade into the background, but tonight it felt louder, heavier, like it was pressing down on us. She straightened suddenly and looked at me, really looked, for the first time that evening. The smile she gave wasn't playful, wasn't flirtatious. It was a pause, a question without words. I felt exposed under it, like she could see everything I'd been trying not to think. "What are we doing?" she asked, voice quiet, almost brittle. I froze. The words weren't a joke. They weren't casual. I swallowed, tried to laugh it off, but it died in my throat. I don't know," I admitted finally. She ran a hand over her face, brushing damp strands of hair behind her ear, and sighed. It's not normal," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the engine but not really looking at it. "I keep telling myself it is, but—" her words trailed off, leaving the air thick and electric. I wanted to reach out, to say something that would fix it, or at least lessen the tension, but I didn't. Because no words would fix this. None of my gestures, none of my jokes, none of the small touches that had seemed so innocent before. I stayed still, letting the silence stretch, letting her voice fill the space that had been buzzing between us for weeks. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, but her posture was loose, like she was trying to hold herself together. I noticed the small tremor in her fingers, the faint shadow under her eyes, the way her shoulders seemed heavier than they should be. For the first time, I saw her not as confident, not as untouchable, but as human, fragile, unsure. "I'm tired," she admitted softly, almost to herself, "of pretending this is just work, of pretending it's nothing." Her eyes flicked to mine, and there it was again, that quiet, devastating vulnerability that made my chest ache. I wanted to tell her I felt the same, that I hadn't been pretending either, but the words felt too heavy, too fast, too dangerous. Instead, I just nodded, letting her know without saying it that I understood, that I was here, that I was caught in the same impossible tension. We stood like that for a long moment. Rain pounded against the windows, the only sound in the room apart from our breathing. My fingers itched to bridge the space between us, to offer some kind of comfort or reassurance, but I didn't. Because it wasn't about comfort. It was about truth, about finally acknowledging the storm that had been building quietly for too long. Finally, she whispered, almost breaking the spell of silence, "I don't know if I can do this without it breaking me." And in that single, fragile line, everything hung between us. The longing, the restraint, the unspoken rules, and the dangerous gravity pulling us closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. Not yet. I was sorting through the small drawer of manuals when I noticed a folded piece of paper sticking out from under a stack of receipts. I picked it up, unfolding it carefully, expecting notes or instructions, but it was a photograph. A younger version of her, laughing at the camera, standing next to someone I didn't recognize. She came up behind me, and I almost dropped it. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice low-guarded. "Right here," I said, handing it to her. I tried not to stare at her too long, but the way her hands shook slightly as she took the photo made it impossible to look away. Her eyes softened, and she let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh. "I haven't looked at that in years." She paused, biting her lip, tracing the outline of the person next to her. That was someone I lost a long time ago. It's stupid, I know. Sometimes I still think about them, even though I shouldn't. I didn't know what to say. The room felt impossibly quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater and the distant sound of cars passing outside. I wanted to bridge the gap, to tell her it was okay to feel, to let her grief be something shared instead of carried alone. "You're not stupid," I said finally. My voice was softer than I intended, and I caught her glancing at me, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. I remember you telling me once about someone who mattered." Her gaze dropped again, and she nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Yeah, it's just hard sometimes, remembering how much it hurt, how empty it felt when it was gone." Her fingers lingered on the edge of the photo, curling around it gently, as though she could hold the memory close without letting it slip entirely. I felt a lump in my throat. I wanted to reach out, to place my hand over hers, to let her know that she wasn't alone, but I didn't. I stayed silent, letting her carry the weight for the moment, and in that silence, the air between us shifted. "Do you ever?" she started, then hesitated, shaking her head. "Never mind." I didn't push. I just nodded, trying to communicate without words that I understood, that I was listening. She looked at me again, and for a brief second, her usual armor, the confident, self-contained exterior, was gone. There was only her, raw and human, and it knocked the ground out from under me in the most gentle, disarming way. She tucked the photo back into the drawer, closing it slowly, like she was sealing a memory she wasn't ready to let fully go. Then she leaned against the counter, arms crossed, but her shoulders were heavier now, and her eyes flicked to mine with an honesty that left me reeling. I'm sorry," she said softly, almost as if she were apologizing to herself. I didn't answer immediately. I just stayed where I was, watching her, feeling the air between us thicken with the weight of unspoken things. And then she smiled, a small, fragile curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes, and I realized that everything had changed, quietly but completely, in that one small, human moment. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about her, about how her past had slipped into the present in the most unexpected way, and how it had shifted everything between us. The shop was quiet now, empty except for the soft hum of the heater and the faint tick of the fluorescent lights. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving everything wet and gleaming under the street lamps. I was sitting on the edge of the workbench, trying to focus on tightening the last bolts, but I wasn't really thinking about the engine at all. She leaned against the counter across from me, arms crossed, but her posture had softened. There was no teasing now, no guarded confidence, just presence. I watched her for a long moment, noticing how tired her eyes looked, how the corners crinkled when she finally gave me a small, genuine smile. "You're quiet," she said finally, breaking the silence. I guess I am," I admitted. My voice sounded strange to me in the stillness. "Just thinking." She tilted her head, studying me. "About what?" "About this," I said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us, the shared silence, the weeks of tension, the small moments that had built into something I couldn't name until now. Her eyes softened, but she didn't answer, and that silence was enough. For the first time, it felt like we didn't need words. Everything that had been unspoken, the stolen glances, the lingering touches, the subtle confessions hidden in our hands and smiles, was finally acknowledged without being said aloud. I shifted slightly on the workbench, and she stepped closer, just enough that our knees brushed. She didn't move away. I didn't either. I reached out, almost without thinking, and our hands touched, fingers brushing lightly, hesitantly, until they settled together. It was small, almost nothing, and yet it carried all the weight of everything we'd avoided admitting. She didn't pull back. She just let her hand rest against mine, and I realized that in this quiet space, there was no need for grand gestures or declarations. The decision had been made between us, silently, in how we let ourselves be near each other. We sat that way for what felt like forever, listening to the faint dripping of rainwater from the roof and the soft hum of the lights. No one else was here, no interruptions, no rules, Just the two of us finally inhabiting the same space without pretense. Her fingers tightened around mine, just a fraction, and I felt something inside me unclench, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been holding. She tilted her head, resting it slightly toward my shoulder, and I didn't move. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. We were already together, in the only way that mattered. I exhaled slowly, feeling the warmth of her hand, the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the weight of everything unspoken settling between us. It wasn't a storybook moment. It wasn't perfect. It was human, messy, earned. Finally, she straightened just enough to glance at me, eyes soft but steady. No words were exchanged, and yet everything had shifted. I smiled faintly, squeezing her hand once, lightly, almost reverently. And in that simple gesture, I knew this, whatever this was ours. Quiet, unspoken, inevitable. I think about that evening often, the quiet shop, the fading storm, the way the air felt impossibly heavy and yet somehow safe. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no fireworks, no rushed confessions. Just presence. Shared space. The slow, careful crossing of a line we both knew had always been there, waiting. I see her sometimes in the small details. The way her hands move when she's focused, the faint crease that appears between her brows when she's thinking, the softness in her voice when she finally lets someone in. And I see myself, a younger man who once fumbled over words and gestures, learning how to simply be. Not to fix things, not to impress, not to chase, but to exist alongside her in a way that felt earned. We both changed. She learned, I think, that letting someone close doesn't mean losing herself, that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's its own kind of strength. And I learned that patience, observation, and silence can speak louder than words, that love doesn't always need to be declared to exist. Sometimes I catch myself smiling at the memory of tiny, inconsequential moments. The brush of her hand as she passed a tool, the almost touch by the workbench, the quiet confession in her eyes when she thought I wasn't watching. Those small gestures became everything. They were proof of the human, flawed, fragile way we moved toward each other, step by cautious step. Love, I realized, isn't always fireworks. It's the spaces between words, the glances that linger, the quiet acknowledgement that someone else sees you fully and still chooses to stay. It's learning to balance longing with respect, desire with restraint, and realizing that connection doesn't have to be loud to be real. And sometimes, even now, I find myself watching her across a room, feeling that same quiet pull, remembering the early days, the hesitation, the tension, the storm of unspoken things that slowly became ours. There's a warmth in that memory, a satisfaction in knowing that we didn't need perfection to find something meaningful. We aren't a fairy tale. We aren't flawless. But the moments we shared, the small victories, the unspoken confessions, the silent decisions to stay near each other, have left a mark that I carry every day. They remind me that slow-burning, messy, human love can exist, and sometimes it's stronger for being earned the hard way. So, I sit here now, sometimes in the quiet, sometimes thinking back with a smile, understanding that the gravity between us was always real. It just took time for us to notice it, to respect it, and finally to accept it. And when I catch her hand across the workbench now, just a touch, just a pause, I know we've arrived. Not with a climax, not with a declaration, but with presence, with trust, with the quiet, unshakable understanding that we are here, together, because we chose to be. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?